leaked in every single seam in that thing. I'm serious, man. I felt like I was sleeping outside. And of course, the kids said, Mr. Brian, what's up with this tent? I don't know what's wrong with this tent. This is terrible. This is terrible. And so we're trying to get, dry. And I ran out of my tent, ran over to Roy's tent. I opened up his tent. I look in there, and they're all sound asleep. I mean, dry as a bone. I'm like, Roy, what? I said,
Are you guys wet? No. Leave us alone.
This will be good.
So I went down to my tent and I told all the guys, let's go. We're all going to the van.
I got up and Roy said, how you like that new tent, Brian?
You know what, Neil? People in life groups sure are happy.
And how happy are they, Michael?
Happier than a sound guy with a ton of vocal effects. Yeah, that makes me feel a little bit better about what I had to do. My name is Michael Bartlett, and I'm the pastor of involvement here. And like Brian said earlier, we are starting a life group series. We're going to spend the next 3 weeks talking about the importance of life groups, why people need to be in life groups, and just why life groups are awesome. And so I'm really excited to bring this message to you and to start the series off. As the pastor of involvement, I often, I say it on Sunday mornings, that's my position. I often have a lot of people say, what is that? And so that's okay. It's a little bit vague. My goal is to get you connected here at ACC. But one of the areas that I love and I pray for, and one of the ministries that I take care of are the life groups. And so I'm really excited to be able to share with you guys about life groups, about where we're going with them, and just why ultimately they're awesome. And I can say as somebody who's in a life group and someone who led a life group that I am happier than our sound guy with a ton of vocal effect, even when Brian has auto-tune. So he also kind of sounded like he was like witness protection for a little bit if we just blurred out his face. So before we get started today, if you have a Bible, go ahead and take that out. If you have your smartphone, go ahead and grab that. If you need a Bible, go ahead and raise your hand. We've got some really good and awesome ushers who will bring those to you. And if you don't own a Bible and want to take one home, take it, please. They're hardcover black Bibles that we have in the back, or raise your hand now. Maybe you know somebody that needs a Bible that's never had one before. We want you guys to feel free to grab these, take these home, write in it. They're all yours. And while we hand those out, we're going to start today with a little quiz. I was kind of expecting you guys to groan a little bit. Good. It's a good quiz, I promise. So we're going to start. If you have a pen or paper, I would suggest trying to write it down, see if you can answer these questions. If not, try to run through it in your head. Go ahead and feel free to talk to your neighbors while we run through this as well. But question number 1, name the team who won this year's Super Bowl. Yeah, you guys got that. That was a gimme. I'm just warming you up for the rest because they're really hard. Number 2, name the teams who have won the past 5 Super Bowls. Feel free to you can write it down. Number 3, name the 5 wealthiest people in the world. Yeah, not the United States. Also, one of them is not Oprah. I thought it was, but I was wrong. I had somebody tell me in between service that I was wrong. Number 4, name the last 5 Heisman Trophy winners. That's for the best, like the MVP of college football, essentially. All right, let's go on to number 5. Number 5, name the last 5 winners of the Miss America pageant. If you can do this, I'm impressed, by the way. If you can't think of their name, but you know the state, which is also weird that you would know that, feel free to write that down. Number 6, name 10 people who've won the Nobel or Pulitzer Prize. There's a lot more silence after that question. And then number 7, name the last 6 Academy Award winners for Best Actor and Actress. Pretty sure they just announced this like a week ago too. So how many of you struggled to get through that list? Yeah. I consider myself someone who knows pop culture, and I can't like name half of these. So let's move on. That one was tough. Let's move on to an easier quiz. We'll go to an easy one. Number 1, name 3 teachers who aided your journey through school. Number 2, name 5 friends who helped you through a difficult time. Number 3, name 5 people who have taught you something worthwhile. You decide what's worthwhile, by the way. Number 4, think of a few people who have made you feel appreciated and special. And number 5, think of 5 people you enjoy spending your time with. For parents, I certainly hope you write your children's name. Just throwing that out there. Now, how many people struggle with this list? This one should have been a lot easier for us to go through. I actually got this in an email, one of those cheesy, like, chain emails. Mark, our associate pastor, emailed it to me like a week or 2 ago and was like, hey, I know this is cheesy, but you should read it. And usually if anybody says, I know this is cheesy, but, I usually just delete it right away. But I was like, you know what, I'll check it. And, I read through it, and, it has this quiz, has both questions, and ultimately it leads up to the final point, which is you're going to have an easier time filling out this second list because the people that you write down are people that you have relationships with. These are people who you know. These are people who you might see on a daily basis. You might talk to weekly. You might text them every once in a while. But these are people in your life that you have a connection with. And when I was going through that list, I actually found when I was going through it, the same name kept popping up. When you think about people you like to spend time with, they're typically the people who have helped you through a difficult time. So I'm sure some of you, when you're running through that, you started writing down these names. You're like, oh, this person kind of fits into all those categories. And so ultimately, these people who have impacted you, and these people, when you're young or when you're older, have impacted you because of the fact that you have a relationship with them. And when I was going through, this one name kept popping up for me, this one person in my life that I've had a very long and great relationship with, and his name's Dan Smith. Now, Dan is currently the lead minister at a church in Cleveland, Ohio, and I met Dan when I was in middle school. I first started going to church when I was in middle school. My parents and I and my siblings, we didn't grow up in church, but we had neighbors who were really nice but kind of a little weird, and so they invited us to church one time, and we're like, I don't think we're going to go because you guys don't wear shoes. And they assured us, no, we wear shoes on Sunday, so we'll go to church. So we went to church with them to check it out for the first time, and we liked it. It was different. It felt normal. So a few months into it, we decided we want to learn more. We want to ask more questions and kind of know more about God and church. And so we asked Dan Smith and his wife Shannon over to our house for dinner. Dan and Shannon had been working at this church for just a little while, not too long. They're a young couple. They're just a great people, and we really connected with them. So we're like, let's have dinner with them. So we invite them over for dinner, and my whole family's sitting down, eating. And once we get done, it was time for questions. Now, my parents grew up Catholic, so my dad was kind of scared of church, definitely very defensive of church. And so once dinner ended, it was like the gloves are off. It's time to have these discussions. So we're sitting there and we're talking, and they're asking a bunch of questions, things as a middle schooler. I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about, but still wanted to be there. And we're having this conversation, and in the middle of this conversation, this nasty, disgusting smell starts to fill our kitchen. And when I say nasty, it's the worst thing I've ever smelled in my life. Starts permeating through our house. And so I'm sitting there at the dinner table, and I'm like, does anybody else smell this? I'm looking around to see anybody. Nobody's reacting. So there's always that moment when you're like, is this me? Like, am I that smell? And you're sitting there, and so you begin to look around, and you're like, is anybody else noticing this smell? You guys know if you've ever been in an elevator or a car with people, public transportation, you're like, what is that smell? So you try to make eye contact with people so they know, like, hey, it's not me, So, I'm looking around, and I realize, okay, my dad has this look on his face like, what is going on? He's got that nasty, like, who farted smell. And so I'm looking at my dad, I'm like, okay. And I look over at Dan and Shannon, and they've kind of got the same look. So at this moment, everybody at the table believes that everybody else at the table created this nastiness. And so, the polite thing to do is to continue talking. Instead of stopping and saying, what is that? We just all continue to have our conversation. And as we're continuing our conversation, my cat, named Cuddles, very large and furry cat, moseys his way on into the kitchen. And when we see Cuddles, we notice Cuddles, his fur had been burnt from his front legs all the way down to his hind legs. Cuddles decided to walk over an open flame and had caught on fire. So the nastiness was mangy outdoor cat hair smell that was burning in my house. The cat was okay, for all you pet people out there. But ultimately, as soon as we saw this, everybody starts cracking up. We all start laughing. And in the middle of this laughter, Dan looks at my dad and goes, man, I thought you farted. And so this was the first time that I met Dan Smith. This was the beginning of my relationship with Dan. A few years later, Dan and I continued to get to know each other, and I ended up at a week of church camp where he was the guest speaker. And the guest speaker at the week of church camp is like a celebrity. So like everybody knows him, everyone wants to hang out with him. And actually, I got a picture here. This is Dan in the middle, and this is me. And this is Curtis Taylor, youth pastor, who's gained like 600 pounds of muscle since he was. We always joke that his head has always been the same size and his body has just like gotten so jacked. So that's Curtis. But we ended up going to church camp together, and breakfast, lunch, and dinner, Dan would sit down and have those meals with me and my friends. And he really took the time to get to know me, and he knew I was struggling with this God thing, and he knew I was trying to figure it out even if I was at church camp. He really took the time to grow in a relationship with me over that week. So much so that when we got back, Dan started a Halo Day, which meant every Saturday we'd go over to his house and we'd play video games. A group of 8 high schoolers and Dan, him and his wife would make food, drinks, all that stuff. We'd put couches back to back so like you couldn't cheat and like see somebody else's screen. And we would do this every Saturday. It was probably the highlight of my week. And as this group continued to meet and as this group continued to play video games, the beginning started to change. Instead of jumping right into video games and food, Dan would sit us down and start asking us questions. Knowing we were high school guys, he'd ask us, like, what are you struggling with? What are some of the things that you're dealing with right now in your life? And Dan asking these questions would say, okay, now what are we going to do about this? This person right here, they're going to hold you accountable. This person right here, we're going to pray for you right now. And this group actually turned into a group of 8 high school guys that we began like an accountability group. A group of 8 guys that would meet on Saturdays. We stopped playing video games, and we would talk about these things we were struggling with, the things we're going through. And it really was kind of this catalyst into my relationship with Jesus and into my understanding of church and growing in that way. And so as I continued to grow, I stepped up and tried to do more leadership things. We had life group as a high school and middle school. We did our life groups, and so I was like, man, I want to lead one. And so I stepped up and I started leading a life group. And as I was leading these things, there was another group a few miles away, I think it was like 10 miles away, and they had another leader who I hated. I hated this girl so much. Her name was Monica, and she was evil. And, okay, maybe not really, but Monica and I did not get along. See, what had happened was she ended up, one of my friends, one of my guys that were in my accountability group, she dated him and broke up with him. So, of course, high school drama. I know, you guys are shocked there was drama in high school. So what ended up happening was I did not like this girl. But what would happen is when our youth group would come together, you could feel that anger and that animosity. Her group of friends and my group of friends. And it started to kind of divide us and separate us and really was just such a negative force on our youth group. And this continued to grow and get worse for about 6 months. And about 6 months into this huge fight, it just became known that we were fighting. I got a phone call from Dan, of course. And Dan said, hey, I want you to do a skit with me one Sunday morning. And I'm thinking, I hate acting. I'm so uncomfortable doing anything. These videos make me feel so uncomfortable. I was telling Jesse while we were practicing, I was like, I don't know what to do with my hands. And he's like, just put them at your side, dude. So I was like, well, I don't really want to do a skit, but because it's Dan, because of this relationship, because I trusted him, I was like, sure, absolutely, I'd love to do it. So Dan's like, all right, we're going to do a skit from Saturday Night Live. He's like, I'm going to be Matt Foley. I'm going to be a motivational speaker. And you're going to be one of the kids that I'm trying to motivate. And so I'd seen the skit before. It's ridiculous. It's amazing. And he's like, we're going to act this out. We're going to do this on a Sunday morning. So I was like, sure, Dan, I trust you. So I showed up on a Wednesday night, and I got there a little bit early just to hang out with him. And I get there, and I'm like, so who's playing my parents? He's like, oh, yeah, Kevin and Cindy Connor, they're going to do it. They're not coming tonight. And I was like, oh, that's awkward. I thought we were practicing. He goes, well, I invited your sister to come so you guys can practice together. And I was like, oh, cool, yeah, who's my sister? And he goes, you remember that girl that you don't talk to, Monica? Yeah, she's your sister. So Dan essentially did the bait and switch. Hey, come be in a skit. Just kidding, you're going to work out your differences with this person. So, yeah, it was great. I was really happy at that point. I couldn't drive at the time, so I was like stuck in his house. So Dan, before we did this skit together, which was a real thing, we did do the skit, he made Monica and I sit down and to work out our stuff. He saw what it was doing to our youth group, and he saw the way it was messing with our people, and he called us out on it. And I can say that was kind of a really big part of my life in understanding what it meant to lead and take a step forward. That kind of pushed me into doing more leadership things. So much so that I started to love church. I would serve on a Sunday. I would go on a Sunday. I would do youth group, do accountability. I was doing everything, and I loved it. I loved my friends. I loved what we did. It was great. And finally, we got to a point where I was about to graduate high school, and I was like trying to figure out, where am I going to go? What am I going to do? So I decided to apply to a few local schools. I grew up in Northern Virginia, so I applied to George Mason University. And I was like, you know what? I just want to go get a business degree or something. I've never taken a business class in my life. I was like, because that's what people do. So I'm going to do a businessy thing, and I'm going to keep going to church, though. I don't really want to continue too much, but just enough to go. And so I was like, that's my plan. And we were sitting down together, and it was tradition that we took all the seniors, and we'd sit them all together, and before we graduated, the leaders and people in our lives would encourage us. We'd sit down together, and someone's like, you know what? I'm going to be a biology major. Awesome, you're going to be the best biology major ever. Yeah, congratulations, let's pray for you. Next word, I want to be a nurse. Yes, you're going to be a great nurse. And so I was like, man, I'm ready for this. I'm ready to feel pumped up about my decision. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to George Mason, and I'm going to major in business. And immediately I got cut off. Dan's wife, Shannon, stood up and was like, hold on 1 second. And she was like, you are an idiot. So I was like, at this point, I'm like kind of taken aback. Shannon's very quiet, so you don't really see that coming from her. But she'd known me for years, so it's like, cool, okay, I trust you. She said, everybody in this room understands that God is calling you to do more than that. And she's like, everybody here knows that you are making a mistake and that you are ignoring God. And she's like, it's stupid that you think that you're following God right now. And she's like, that's all. And sat back down. I mean, and I was definitely hurt. I was definitely affected. But to be honest, I knew she was right. And I knew that Dan and Shannon knew me well enough to say these things into my life. And so I decided, all right, I'm not going to do that. I ended up going into school for ministry. And I still joke with her about that story, and she's like, I didn't say that. But she did, I promise. She's so quiet. She pretends like she's not vicious on the inside. But she essentially, that encouragement kind of propelled me into taking that next step, was really following what I felt God was calling me to do, which was ministry. And so I ended up at Milligan College and loved it. I loved it. I loved the classes. I loved the people I was connecting with. I loved doing ministry stuff. My junior year, I got ready to do an internship, and I was really excited. I was asked to be on what we call camp teams. That's where they take 12 juniors, and it's an internship, but they pay you a ton of money to hang out at church camps all summer. So I'm thinking, jackpot. Of course I would love to get paid a lot of money and do an internship and cross that requirement off at the same time. So I sign up for this, I get in, I interview, do all this stuff. I start doing the training. I'm going through the lesson writing and the development, and I get an email from the president of our college. And the president said, Michael, I appreciate your interest, but we'd like to ask you to step off the camp teams. Essentially, your experiences here at Milligan, the pranks that you had pulled, we worry about you and children being together. So I was asked not to be on this camp teams. They didn't trust me with high schoolers which is also why I'm not a youth minister, by the way. We had pulled some pranks in school, and of course they all went wrong. And so they asked me to not be a part of this, and I was kind of devastated, and I didn't really know what to do. So I did the best thing I could, which is I called Dan. Dan, at this point, was up in Ohio, and I knew he knew a lot of people, and he could vouch for my character. The things that we did in college were just silly pranks. So I called Dan. I'm like, I don't know what to do. And Dan goes, come to Ohio. He's like, we'd love to have you. Come for 3 months. So I packed my truck, and when my junior year ended, I drove up to Cleveland, Ohio. I lived with a stranger. I'd never met this guy before in my life. And I spent 3 months in Cleveland, Ohio working, and Dan spent that time mentoring me. While I was there, I learned a very valuable lesson about being a mirror instead of a window. I was very good at saying, this is wrong because this person, and this is wrong because this person. But Dan one time pulled me aside and said, you need to understand that you need to look at yourself before you look at other people. And being a 22-year-old who thought I knew everything, I was kind of a punk about it, but Dan didn't back down. And I'm very grateful that he continued to pour into me. When I got back to school, my wife and I, it was our senior year, and we were getting ready to get married. So, of course, when it came to performing our wedding, there was only one person that we would ask, and that was Dan Smith. Dan gladly came from Cleveland, Ohio, to perform our wedding. And, I've done weddings, and I've been to weddings, and I don't see many ministers who cheese it this much at a wedding. There's a few pictures, and it's kind of creepy, but there's a few pictures where my wife and I are like, walking romantically on the beach, and Dan's in the background. But ultimately what it is Dan was just so happy for us. As somebody who I've known since middle school, he was so happy to be a part of it, and we wouldn't have asked anybody else to perform that wedding for us. After we got married, we ended up moving to Cleveland, Ohio. We spent a year there, and a few months into my internship, Curtis Teal, our youth pastor, came up as well to do an internship and to kind of disciple under these leaders. And because Dan's relationship with me and the friendship that he had with me, he had also become friends with Curtis. And so it was really natural when Curtis got there for Dan to begin mentoring Curtis. And then for me, because I was doing a different area, Dan's best friend, James, it was really easy for James to begin to mentor me. And so what started as a relationship, a friendship when I was in middle school, turned into, now I know I have 2 people in ministry that I can count on, and 2 relationships that I can count on. And not only that, but Dan has developed other relationships. And I can honestly say that, my life wouldn't be the same without Dan Smith. And what started as a cat catching on fire has led to this place right now where I can share with you guys about how awesome life groups are and how awesome relationships are, and how much we need those. And it's not just coming from me. Relationships are such a part of God's plan for us and such a part of the Bible. How many of you guys, have you ever heard of the one another passages or each other passages? There are 59 verses in the second half of the Bible in the New Testament that tell you what it means to be in a relationship. They tell you what it looks like, and they tell you how to live out these relationships with people. And so today we're going to start with one. We're going to start on page 698. John 13, 34 through 35. Of all the one another's, this is the one that appears the most. And so I want you guys to read this one with me. This is what it says. I give you a new command. Love one another. Just as I have loved you, you must also love one another. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you have love for one another. 2 verses, 3 times. Love one another just as I have loved you. We are called to love people the same way that Jesus has loved us, which is him giving up himself on a cross for us. And then it continues, and my favorite part is verse 35. By this, all people will know that you are my disciples if you have loved one another. People will know that you follow me. People will know that you imitate me because you love other people. I can honestly say the worst thing in church and the worst thing in Christianity are people who call themselves Christians and don't love people. And a lot of us have experienced that before, and a lot of us, we're checking out ACC, but we've been burnt before by Christians who have no love, and it's hard. And ultimately, this is what it's saying, that if you are going to follow me and if you're going to be a part of this relationship, you have to love people. And it continues. It's actually in there 12 times. And I've learned through extensive Bible research that the more it's in there, the more important it is. 12 times. I mean, you've got John 15:12, John 15:17, Romans 13:8, 1 Thessalonians 4:9, 1 Peter 1:22, 1 Peter 4:8 continues, 1 John 3:11, 1 John 3:23, 1 John 4:7, 1 John 4:11 and 12, and 2 John 1:5. Love one another shows up 12 times in the Bible. And there's 59 of them, so you've got 37 more. And ultimately, the root of it is love. But it continues. And we're going to go through these in alphabetical order. Just so you know, we're going to go through all of them. If you get through and you're like, man, I'd really like those, I have all this stuff printed, and you can come find me, and I'll gladly send this to you. First service, you had a bunch of people trying to write it all down. Don't stress about that. Just, go through it with me. If you want that stuff, come find me, and I'll get it to you. The first one says, accept one another. And that immediately makes me think of Dan, and, he had the opportunity to sit down with my family because he accepted us. Because he knew, we're a messed up family. He knew we didn't know what we were talking about. He knew my parents' past, but he accepted us and he loved us, and he showed up for dinner to care for us and to build that relationship. Admonish one another. Admonish means advise against doing something. Shannon, when she stood up and said, this is a bad idea, that's part of relationships. That's part of having a relationship with someone. Sometimes you have to tell people that's a bad idea. That's going to hurt you. That's going to hurt your family. That's going to hurt your friends. Once you start that, you're not going to be able to stop. True, real relationships give us the opportunity to admonish and urge people, don't do it. And if you're in true relationships with those people, you'll take it too. You won't fight it. Bear with each other. Be at peace with one another. The time Dan bamboozled me and made me sit down with Monica and work out our differences, he understood how important it was as people in the church, as people who had mutual friends, to be at peace with one another. Be devoted to one another. Be kind and compassionate to one another. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Patience. That is probably the thing I'm the worst at. But this is such a root of our relationships. I know for me that if I didn't have people that were patient with me, especially in high school, I was a punk, man. I was a punk. If Dan wasn't patient with me, I wouldn't be here today. Patience is a huge part of our relationships. Build each other up. Encouragement. Text messages, letters, notes. You did a great job. I'm proud of you. They're the root of relationships. Carry each other's burdens. Part of being in a relationship with someone is when someone is going through a problem and someone is fighting something, as their friend, you carry that burden with them. We can't do things alone. There's a sin in our life that we're trying to carry that burden. We're trying to get rid of it on our own. We need people. Sometimes we get to the point where I can't even carry myself. I need those people to carry me, and that's a part of relationships. Clothe yourselves with humility towards one another. Confess your sins to each other. That one's a little bit scary, isn't it? Can you imagine what our relationships would look like if we actually took the time to tell people what we were struggling with, instead of this like, how are you? Oh, I'm great. When deep down inside you're struggling, you're hurting, you're longing for something. Part of relationships, and something that Dan made us do, was to say, what are you struggling with? What are those things that are holding you back? Consider others better than yourself. Do not grumble against each other. Do not lie to each other. Do not slander one another. Encourage each other. And that's in there 4 times. Obviously has to be important. We need to encourage people. People need that. They need to feel built up. They need to feel loved. Forgive each other. This one's tough. Part of friendship is people are going to hurt you, on purpose, on accident. Your friends will hurt you. But a big part of it is the ability to forgive them and move on. Sometimes you need that to grow in your relationships. If all my friends that I've hurt didn't forgive me, I'd be a lonely guy. Greet one another with a holy kiss. Yeah? I would say, I talked to Mark, who is our Greek expert, and actually that's translated as fist bump, but the Bible says holy kiss, I don't know. So greet one another with a holy fist bump. We're okay with that. Have equal concern for each other. Instruct one another. Part of relationships is taking the time to teach. And part of that is also the ability to be taught. You don't know everything. We don't know everything. I don't know everything. But, let's work through this together. Live in harmony with one another. Make your love increase and overflow with each other. You should have so much love that it overflows. You should be able to impact, your relationship with this person should have so much love that it impacts the people around them, that it's contagious. Make your love increase. Oh, sorry, next one. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. This one's, it's easy to offer hospitality, but it's really hard to do it without grumbling. It's that, my wife and I talk all the time, we're like, we really want to invite people over, but then we'd have to vacuum, and I really would rather just leave all my junk on the floor. But ultimately, if we're offering hospitality, we should want to do it. It shouldn't be something that's a burden to us. Pray for each other. That's a huge one. Serve one another in love. Don't just serve, but in love. It's one thing to do something. It's another to do it because you want to. And really, it makes a bigger impact that way. Spur one another towards love and good deeds. This one's my favorite. To spur, when you think about it, you should think about, a cowboy riding a horse. They've got the spurs on their boots, and to get the horse to get it to go faster, to get it to do what it needs to do, the cowboy will put those spurs in its side. We need that in our relationships. It's not comfortable. It doesn't feel good, but it's what we need sometimes. It's what people need to do to us to get us moving in the right way. When Shannon stood up and blatantly said in front of a bunch of friends and mentors and my parents that I was an idiot, it hurt. But I can honestly say that they knew the direction I needed to go in. They knew where I needed to be, and they were just trying to spur me on, towards love and good deeds. Speak to one another with psalms, hymns, and spiritual songs. I expect that after service today that you all are singing to each other. Stop biting and devouring one another. Stop passing judgment on one another. Stop provoking and envying each other. Submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. Submission is hard to do, but part of being in a relationship is understanding what it means to submit. And I think that's a really difficult thing that we all need to work on. Teach one another. You have a skill. You have an ability. You need to be using that to help other people, to teach them. And it could be, maybe it's just this whole God thing. Maybe you need to teach somebody what it means to read the Bible, or even teach them what it means to be in a relationship. Hopefully, this sermon is equipping you to know more about what it means to be in a relationship. How amazing would it be if we took that to our other relationships and taught people what this looked like? There'd be a lot of awesome relationships in Glen Burnie. Use the gifts you have received to serve others. You have gifts, you have talents. If you're not using them to help others, you're wasting them. Wash one another's feet and wait for each other when you come together to eat. I like food. That one's tough. I added another one in there that's not in the Bible. Compare yourself to one another. I was reading this book the other day, and they're talking about the one another's, and the guy said, of all the one another's in the Bible, of the 59 that we're called to do, the one that's the easiest is comparing yourselves to other people. Because what we do is we say, you know what? I may not love people exactly this way, but I definitely do it better than that person over there. Or I may not do this, but my sister, man, she's terrible. And ultimately, I'm telling you, if compare yourself to one another was supposed to be on this list, I think we'd have 60. But yet, this one's the easiest to do. And so what I'm saying is when we went through these, it's all about you and where you are. Don't judge yourself based on other people. Don't compare yourself to other people, because it's about your relationships with other people and your relationship with God. At ACC, we say, don't do life alone, and we mean it. Think back to that first quiz, those people who have impacted you, those people who, when you were a kid, made a difference in your life, those people who throughout your life, even if it's months apart, have made impact and have brought you to the place you are today, to the relationships you're in today. We need relationships. We need them. We can't do this stuff alone. We need to love one another. We need to encourage one another. We need to greet one another with a holy fist bump. We cannot do life alone, and that's why there are 59 examples of what relationships are in the Bible. And I know some of you today are thinking, man, I wish I had a Dan or Shannon Smith in my life. And I'm saying, if you want that, you need to get in a life group. I'm serious. If you want those relationships, those real relationships, those true relationships, they're not easy. It's not rainbows and butterflies. They're not easy. But if you want real relationships, you need to get in a life group. And maybe some of you are thinking, man, I'm to a point in my life where I feel like I could be that for somebody else. I can be the person that's encouraging them. I can be the person that's loving them. I can be the person that's spurring them on. You need to get into a life group.